Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this class. Wingold Associates presents Environmental Regulations. This presentation will give you an overview of the environmental laws in the United States. Okay, let's jump right into it. So it's important to understand that the environmental regulations in the United States are fairly young, and the majority of them were created as a direct result of an incident and/or emergency, or as a response to a specific pollution causing widespread health issues. As we understand pollution more, it's easier to make the laws to try to control them to protect the health of everyone. So as mentioned in slide 1, most environmental regulations were enacted because of a specific incident. Here is one. For example, in 1969, imagine water so polluted that it could catch fire. That is exactly what happened in Ohio. The water was so polluted, it was introduced to fire, that the river itself caught on fire. This prompted a national reaction and led to eventually the Clean Water Act and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. But more importantly, the national attention to the water pollution led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA hasn't been around long, which explains exactly why the environmental regulations are fairly new in this country. They didn't have an organization to be in charge of drafting and regulating any environmental laws until they stood up in America. So one of the first environmental laws was NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. The National Environmental Policy Act formed the Council on Environmental Quality to advise the President on environmental and review federal agencies' environmental impact statements. What this bill created was a mechanism for all federal agencies to report how their activities impacted the environment. The impact statements would be published in the Federal Register so that the public would be able not only to see what activities were affecting the environment, but they also had the ability to comment on them. So this was one of the first laws to get the public involved with the environmental impacts of the activities in the United States. So right around this period, the National Environmental Policy Act was enacted. The first Earth Day took place. Many of you are familiar with Earth Day. In spring 1970, Senator Gaylord Nelson created Earth Day as a way to force environmental issues onto the national agenda. They didn't have social media platforms or the internet at the time, so it was hard to get information spread across the United States unless it was through the press. At this time, 20 million Americans demonstrated in different U.S. cities, and it worked. In December 1970, Congress authorized the creation of a new federal agency to tackle environmental issues. That was the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA as we know it. It is hard to believe that there were not any individual environmental statutes in the United States before this time, but it is true. But now, Earth Day is celebrated every year by almost 1 billion people worldwide. So as noted in the previous slide, the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency was done on December 2nd, 1970. The EPA's mission was to protect, it still is to protect human health by safeguarding the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the land on which we live. In the same year, the first of the Clean Water Act was developed on December 31st. This was a direct result of very dense and visible fog in many of the big U.S. cities. Fog so bad, pollution so bad that you could not see through it. Congress authorized EPA to set national air quality, auto emission, and anti-pollution standards. The standards led to the production of the catalytic converter in 1973 by New Jersey's Engelhard Corporation. In its first 20 years, the Clean Air Act significantly reduced the presence of lead, sulfur dioxide, and other harmful pollutants in the air. In the following year, the EPA took action on lead-based paint and created lead-based paint restrictions. The purpose was to protect children from the risk of lead exposure. And so Congress restricted the use of lead-based paint in homes and on cribs and toys in the Lead Ban Paint Poisoning Prevention Act. The next EPA action was the ban of DDT. After public concern about the health effects of the pesticide DDT, EPA banned its use and requires extensive review of all pesticides at this time. Next came the creation of the Clean Water Act. In 1972, Congress passed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, now known as the Clean Water Act. The purpose of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the nation's waters by preventing pollution, providing assistance to publicly owned wastewater treatment facilities, and maintaining the integrity of wetlands. Soon after, the creation of the Ocean Dumping Act took place. To increase the focus on the protection of water, Congress enacted the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, or better known as the Ocean Dumping Act, to reduce ocean water pollution. In 1973, the first wastewater permits were issued under the Clean Water Act. Before this, there were no wastewater treatment facilities, and the waste streams from households and industries were going straight into the rivers and the streams throughout the United States without going through a wastewater treatment facility. In the same year, the EPA passed an auto maintenance regulations. The EPA set regulations on car manufacturing and testing for compliance with the Clean Air Act emission standards. Car manufacturers are required to install malfunction warning systems in cars made in 1975 or later. An EPA specified conditions under which manufacturers could perform maintenance to cars during their 50,000-mile test for meeting emission standards. Later that same year, the EPA released a study confirming that lead from automobile exhaust posed a direct threat to public health. On December 8th of that year, EPA issued regulations gradually reducing lead in gasoline. It's important to understand that this was just an initiative to start the reduction of lead and not to eliminate it at this time. In 1974, the EPA enacted the Safe Drinking Water Act. This was one of the most important acts in the United States because it regulated the quality of public drinking water. The Clean Water Act did not cover drinking water. It only covered the waters of the United States. The Safe Drinking Water, until the Safe Drinking Water Act, there was no law on the books to protect the water you drink. In 1976, the EPA enacted the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. RCRA gave EPA authority to control hazardous waste from cradle to grave, including the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal of harmful materials. Later in that year, the Toxic Substance Control Act was passed, TSCA. TSCA tried to curtail the environmental and health risks posed by the growing number of synthetic and organic chemicals in consumer products and the environment. This bill requires manufacturers to disclose the information pertaining to their chemicals to the EPA and to the public. In 1977, the National Drinking Water Standards went into effect for the first time. This was published under the Safe Drinking Water Act, as mentioned in prior slides. For the first time, all public water suppliers were required to test their public water routinely and notify their customers if water was not up to EPA standards. Later in that year, the Clean Water Act went under major revisions. Amending the 1972 version, the Act stressed the importance of toxic pollutant control. As mentioned in earlier slides, most of the environmental laws were triggered by a specific incident. Here's an incident that was one of the biggest disasters, environmental disasters in the United States. In Love Canal in 1978, residents discovered in Love Canal, New York, that it was contaminated by buried leaking chemical containers from a local business. The pollution was linked to serious health threats, such as birth defects and cancer for the residents there and the surrounding areas. It affected almost 700 families directly, and indirectly, I don't think they have the numbers. Uh, Fortunately, the good news was that it did trigger the EPA and Congress to pass the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Compensation and Liability Act, also known as Superfund Act. The CERCLA was designed to hold the businesses, the polluters, responsible, not only financially but criminally, and it has worked very well in the United States. Unfortunately, it took an incident like this to enable a law to be created to do that. Here we have another incident, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. The severe meltdown at 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania raised concerns in the United States over using nuclear power for energy. The EPA assisted the Nuclear Regulatory Agency in mitigating this and developing laws in the future to safeguard such incidents like this. So in 1979, the PCB phase out begins. The EPA begins phasing out the production and the use of PCBs. PCBs are a family of synthetic chemicals used in paint, cement, and other household and commercial products. They're very toxic because of their persistence in the environment. They're very hard to destroy. They move from one media to the other very easily, and they also move from species to species. As mentioned in the earlier slide, in 1980, Congress created the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Compensation and Liability Act, known as CERCLA or the Superfund Law. And again, this was in a direct response to the Love Canal incident. And in 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was enacted by Congress, again, a direct result from the 3 Mile Island incident. In 1984, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, the Hazardous Waste Law, went under some serious amendments. The amendments established requirements governing generators, transportators, and disposers of small quantities of hazardous waste, put a wider net over the regulation and who was involved. It also focused on landfill disposal, the old technique of just taking waste and putting it underground. Started realizing that there was serious environmental consequences for that, and regulations around landfills managing those waste for long term. Here's another example of an incident that triggered an environmental law in the United States. The difference between this incident did not happen in the United States. It happened in India. A Union Carbide plant released 40 tons of poisonous gas, killing or injuring over 170,000 people living nearby. Consequently, Congress acted quickly